January 16th, 1940. Washington, D.C., Sunday morning. The Oval Office sits silent. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt opens the manila folder handed to him by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., the only Jewish member of his cabinet. Inside is an 18-page report with a title so explosive it had to be changed before the president could see it. The original heading read, "Report to the Secretary on the acquiescence of this government in the murder of the Jews." Someone crossed it out. The new title sounds more diplomatic. Personal report to the president, but the content remains devastating. It accuses Roosevelt's own State Department of willful complicity and genocide, of actively suppressing information about the systematic murder of millions, of using bureaucratic red tape as a weapon against desperate refugees. The president scans the pages. He knows what this means. For 18 months, reliable intelligence about Hitler's extermination plan has reached his desk. For 18 months, he's been told exactly what's happening in occupied Europe. And for 18 months, he's done almost nothing. Now his own Treasury Department is calling him out. This is the story of how America knew, how Roosevelt knew, and how the most powerful leader of the free world chose to look the other way while 6 million Jews were murdered. It's a story about warnings ignored, reports buried, and a bureaucratic machinery designed not to rescue but to obstruct. What you're about to discover would challenge everything you thought you knew about America's role in World War II. Let's go back to where it started. August 8, 1940. Geneva, Switzerland. A 31-year-old Jewish lawyer named Gerhard Riegner walks into the American consulate in a state of what the diplomats later described as great agitation. He's just learned something that sounds impossible, something so horrifying that part of him hopes it can't be true, but his source is impeccable. Eduard Schulte, a German industrialist with access to the highest levels of the Nazi regime, has just revealed that Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, has approved a plan to murder every Jew in Europe. Do not relocate them. Do not imprison them. Murder them. All of them. Between 3.5 and 4 million people. The method? Prussic acid. Zyklon B. The timeline? This fall. Riegner dictates a telegram to American Vice Consul Howard Elting Jr. His hands shake as he speaks. The message is clear and specific. Mass extermination is being planned. It will happen soon. This information must reach Rabbi Stephen Wise, president of the World Jewish Congress in New York, immediately. Elting forwards the message to Leland Harrison, the highest-ranking U.S. diplomat in Switzerland. Harrison reads it and makes a note in the margin. He calls it a war rumor inspired by fear. He doesn't believe it. Still, he sends it to Washington, to the State Department. There, officials read Riegner's telegram and make a decision. They will not forward it to Rabbi Wise. It's too fantastical, too unbelievable. Surely this is just another exaggerated atrocity story, the kind that circulates in every war. They file it away, but Riegner is thorough. He also goes to the British consulate. The British, after some debate, decide to forward his message to Samuel Silverman, a member of Parliament and representative of the World Jewish Congress in London. Silverman, in turn, sends it directly to Rabbi Wise in New York. The telegram arrives on August 29, 3 weeks after Riegner sent it. Rabbi Stephen Wise is one of the most influential Jewish leaders in America. He's known Roosevelt for years. When he receives Silverman's telegram, he immediately sends a copy to Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles. Welles is sympathetic. He tells Wise he'll investigate, but he also asks Wise to keep quiet, not to publicize the information until the State Department can confirm it. Wise agrees. He waits. For 87 days, he waits. During those 87 days, Stephen Wise is in agony. He shares Riegner's information quietly with other Jewish leaders, with some government officials, but he keeps his promise to Welles. He doesn't go public. Meanwhile, the State Department slowly, methodically collects evidence. They contact diplomats in Switzerland. They reach out to the International Red Cross. They consult the Vatican. Every source confirms the same thing. Riegner's information is accurate. By November, Welles can no longer deny the truth. On November 24, 1940, he invited Wise to the State Department. According to Wise, Welles tells him the evidence confirms his deepest fears. 2 million Jews are already dead. Millions more are marked for extermination. The next day, Stephen Wise speaks to the Associated Press. Newspapers across America run the story, though most bury it on inside pages. The headline news is still about battles in North Africa, about American troops fighting in distant deserts. The systematic murder of European Jewry is treated as a secondary story. Still, the Jewish community reacts with anguish and determination. On December 2, 1942, Jews across the world observe an international day of mourning. Thousands of workers in Ecuador pause for 15 minutes in protest. Synagogues in Palestine, Egypt, Australia, and Nicaragua hold services. In New York City, thousands march silently through the streets. Then comes the meeting that would define Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust. December 8, 1942. The Oval Office. Stephen Wise leads a delegation of 5 prominent Jewish leaders to meet with the president. They bring with them a 20-page document detailing the Nazi extermination campaign. 2 million Jews already murdered, millions more in immediate danger. The meeting lasts exactly 29 minutes. 29 minutes. It would be the only meeting Roosevelt would have with Jewish leaders about the Holocaust during the entire war. What does Roosevelt say in those 29 minutes? According to the notes taken by attendees, he expresses sympathy. He calls Hitler an insane man. He promises that Nazi war criminals will be punished after the war is won. He listens to their pleas. Then he shows them out. He takes no immediate action. He issues no executive order. He doesn't call for increased immigration quotas. He doesn't order his State Department to expedite visas. He simply expresses his sympathies and moves on to his next appointment. The Jewish leaders leave frustrated but still hopeful. Surely now that the president knows, something will change. 9 days later, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and 9 Allied governments in exile release the Declaration on Atrocities. It condemns the cold-blooded extermination of the Jews and promises post-war justice. But it offers no rescue plan, no immediate action, just words. Here's what Roosevelt didn't tell those Jewish leaders. Here's what was happening inside his own administration. At the State Department, one man held extraordinary power over the fate of Jewish refugees, Breckinridge Long. Born in 1881 to a wealthy Sainton, Louis family, Long was a Princeton graduate, a lawyer, and a longtime Roosevelt supporter. He'd served as ambassador to Mussolini's Italy from 1933 to 1936, where he developed what his critics called troubling sympathies for fascism. When World War II began, Roosevelt brought him back to Washington as Assistant Secretary of State, putting him in charge of the visa division. That meant Breckinridge Long controlled who got into America and who didn't. And Long had very strong opinions about Jewish refugees. In June 1940, shortly after France fell to the Nazis, Long wrote a memo to State Department colleagues. In it, he explained how to stop refugees from entering the United States. The key, he wrote, was to put every obstacle in the way and require additional evidence and to resort to various administrative advices which would postpone the granting of visas. Long's justification was national security. He claimed that Nazi spies might pose as refugees. That concern wasn't entirely without merit, but Long took it to extremes. He instructed American consular officials abroad to deny visas to anyone with relatives still in Nazi-occupied territory, arguing they could be blackmailed into espionage. That rule alone disqualified nearly every Jewish refugee seeking to escape. In July 1941, Long created a new requirement. Every visa application now needed review in Washington by an interdepartmental committee including the State Department, Justice Department, Military Intelligence, and the FBI. The process, already painfully slow, became glacial. Here's a number that reveals everything. From 1933 to 1945, the United States had an annual quota allowing approximately 153,000 immigrants from European countries. The German and Austrian quota alone was 27,370 per year. In 12 years of Roosevelt's presidency, that quota was filled exactly once. In most years, it wasn't even close. Thousands of visa slots went unused, while millions of Jews desperately sought escape. This wasn't an accident, this was policy. Breckinridge Long's policy, carried out with the implicit approval of the State Department and the passive acceptance of President Roosevelt. But Long wasn't content just to block refugees from entering, he actively worked to suppress information about the Holocaust. When the Riegner telegram arrived in August 1942, it was Long's division that decided not to forward it to Rabbi Wise. When Jewish organizations tried to send money to relief organizations in Europe to help Jews in hiding, Long's office delayed the necessary licenses for months. Every request for action met with the same response: postpone, postpone, postpone. Now we come to July 28, 1943. Another meeting in the Oval Office. Another man with first-hand knowledge of the Holocaust sits across from President Roosevelt. His name is Jan Karski, and his story is almost unbelievable. Karski is a courier for the Polish underground resistance. Born Jan Kozielewski in 1914, he'd been a promising young diplomat before the war. When the Nazis invaded Poland, he joined the resistance, using his photographic memory and language skills to carry messages between the underground and the Polish government in exile in London. He'd been captured by the Gestapo and tortured. He'd attempted suicide to avoid revealing secrets. He'd escaped with help from the resistance. And then, in late 1942, he'd done something extraordinary. Polish Jewish leaders begged him to witness what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto and at the Izbica transit camp. They needed someone who could escape, who could tell the world. Karski agreed. He was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto, where he saw tens of thousands of Jews crammed into a tiny area, dying of starvation and disease. Then he went to Izbica, disguised as a guard, where he watched thousands of Jews being forced into freight cars bound for the Belzec extermination camp. He saw the Nazi guards beat people with clubs. He saw children crushed in the chaos. He heard the screams. Then Karski travelled across occupied Europe to London, carrying his eyewitness testimony. He met with British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. He met with Polish government officials. They listened. They took notes. They did nothing. Now, in July 1943, he sits in the Oval Office with President Roosevelt. The meeting lasts over an hour. Roosevelt asks Karski detailed questions about the situation in Poland, about the resistance, about military matters. Karski answers everything. Then he describes what he witnessed in the ghetto and at Izbica. He pleads for specific action. Bomb the camps, bomb the railways, threaten German cities with retaliation. Do something. Roosevelt listens. He calls the testimony very powerful. Then he moves the conversation back to Polish military resistance. He asks if Karski has seen any horses in Poland. Horses. Karski later recalled his confusion. He just described systematic mass murder, and the President of the United States wanted to know about horses. The meeting ends. Roosevelt takes no action. Karski is devastated. He'd risked his life to bring this testimony. He'd seen things that would haunt him forever, and the most powerful man in the world responded by asking about horses. By 1904, the evidence was overwhelming. American intelligence agencies possessed detailed information about Auschwitz-Birkenau. They knew about the gas chambers. They knew about the crematoria. They knew that by mid-1944, as many as 10,000 people were being murdered there every day. Between May and July 1944 alone, 310,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz and gassed upon arrival. American reconnaissance planes flew over the Auschwitz complex multiple times, taking photographs of the IG Farben synthetic oil plant located less than 5 miles from the gas chambers. The bombers had the range. They had the accuracy. They had photographs showing the exact layout of the camp. Jewish organizations pleaded with the War Department. Bomb the gas chambers. Bomb the railways leading to the camp. Slow down the killing. Save whoever you can. The requests reached Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy. On August 14, 1944, McCloy sent his response. Such an operation, he wrote, could be executed only by the diversion of considerable air support essential to the success of our forces now engaged in decisive operations elsewhere, and would in any case be of such doubtful efficacy that it would not warrant the use of our resources. Less than a week later, American bombers attacked the IG Farben plant near Auschwitz. The bombs fell so close that prisoners in the camp heard the explosions and felt hope for the first time in months. One survivor later remembered, "We were no longer afraid of death, at any rate not of that death. Every bomb that exploded filled us with joy and gave us new confidence in life." The bombers flew right past the gas chambers without targeting them. The message was clear. Military targets were worth the resources. Jewish lives were not. But there were people inside the Roosevelt administration who refused to accept this. 3 men in the Treasury Department, Josiah DuBois Jr., Randolph Paul, and John Pihel, had been investigating financial aspects of rescue efforts. They kept running into the same obstacle. The State Department. Every attempt to send money to help Jews in hiding was blocked. Every request for action was delayed. Every piece of evidence about the Holocaust was suppressed. These 3 Treasury Department lawyers began digging deeper. What they found shocked them. The State Department hadn't just been passive. It had been actively working to prevent rescue efforts and suppress information about the genocide. In January 1944, they compiled their findings into a report. The original title was blunt and damning: Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. The report documented everything: how the State Department had suppressed the Riegner telegram, how Breckinridge long had deliberately created bureaucratic obstacles to prevent refugees from entering, how officials had delayed licenses for rescue organizations trying to save Jewish lives, how information about the Holocaust had been intentionally kept from the American public. The report accused State Department officials of actions so shocking they bordered on complicity in genocide. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., the only Jew in Roosevelt's cabinet, read the report and knew he had a decision to make. This was an attack on another cabinet department. It was political dynamite. But it was also the truth. Morgenthau softened the title to Personal Report to the President and added a cover memo, but he kept the devastating content intact. Then he did something bold. He told Roosevelt he was coming to the White House on Sunday morning, January 16, 1944, and he was bringing this report whether Roosevelt wanted to see it or not. He also made it clear that if Roosevelt didn't act, he would take the report to Congress, and the resulting scandal would dwarf anything the administration had yet faced. Roosevelt read the report. He understood the political calculation immediately. An election was coming in November. If this story broke, if the American public learned that his own State Department had been actively obstructing efforts to save Jews from genocide, the political damage would be catastrophic. He couldn't afford that. But perhaps more than the political calculation, the report finally forced Roosevelt to confront the full scope of what was happening and what his administration had failed to do. 6 days later, on January 22, 1944, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 94-117, creating the War Refugee Board. Its mission was to undertake immediate action for the rescue, transportation, maintenance, and relief of the victims of enemy oppression. It was too late. Millions were already dead, but the War Refugee Board, led by John Paley, one of the men who wrote the damning report, would go on to save an estimated 200,000 lives in the final year of the war. It represented what could have been done years earlier, if only there had been the will to act. So why didn't Roosevelt act sooner? Historians have debated this question for decades. Some point to political calculation. Roosevelt feared that openly championing Jewish refugees would give ammunition to isolationists and anti-Semites in Congress and among the public. A 1939 poll showed that 83% of Americans opposed admitting additional refugees. Roosevelt was a master politician who rarely took stands that lacked public support. Others argue that Roosevelt was constrained by immigration laws passed in the 1920s that set strict quotas. But this explanation falls flat. Even existing quotas were rarely filled. Roosevelt could have quietly ensured that available slots were used. He didn't. Some historians point to the demands of winning the war. Roosevelt and his military advisors genuinely believed that the fastest way to save Jews was to defeat Nazi Germany as quickly as possible, and that diverting resources to rescue operations would slow that victory. But this argument doesn't explain why the United States couldn't do both, couldn't fill immigration quotas while also fighting the war, couldn't bomb railways to camps that were already being photographed by reconnaissance planes. The truth, documented in thousands of pages of records, is more uncomfortable. Roosevelt knew. He knew early. He knew from multiple credible sources, and he chose not to make rescue a priority. Whether that choice came from political calculation, from personal indifference, from anti-Semitic advisors he failed to overrule, or from a genuine but misguided belief that military victory alone was the answer, the result was the same. Millions died who might have been saved. Consider what could have been done. The United States could have filled its existing immigration quotas, which would have saved tens of thousands without changing any laws. It could have created temporary havens for refugees, as it finally did in 1944 when it brought 982 refugees to Fort Ontario, New York, demonstrating that such efforts were feasible. It could have pressured Latin American countries to accept more refugees using the diplomatic leverage it wielded across the hemisphere. It could have threatened German cities with retaliation for every trainload sent to the camps. It could have bombed the railways, the bridges, the camps themselves, disrupting the machinery of death, even if such attacks couldn't stop the Holocaust entirely. It could have established the War Refugee Board in 1942 instead of 1940, instead of 1900,000, but potentially millions. None of these actions would have won the war faster, but none would have significantly slowed the war effort either. They weren't done because they weren't prioritized, because Jewish lives in the cold calculus of wartime decision-making weren't deemed worth the political or military resources required to save them. There's a photograph taken in 1945 of American soldiers liberating concentration camps. The soldiers look stunned, horrified, unable to process what they're seeing. Many accounts describe how American troops couldn't believe the Nazis had done this, couldn't believe human beings were capable of such systematic cruelty. But here's what's haunting about those photographs and those accounts. The American government knew. It had known for years. The soldier shock was genuine, but their commanders, their president, their State Department had detailed knowledge of exactly what was happening. The surprise wasn't at the highest levels of government. It was among the men sent to liberate camps their superiors had known about and chosen not to bomb, not to disrupt, not to prioritize. After the war, in the Nuremberg trials, Nazi war criminals were held accountable. The United States prosecuted those who had perpetrated genocide and those who had been complicit through inaction. But there was no reckoning for the American officials who had suppressed information, obstructed rescue efforts, and turned away desperate refugees. Breckinridge long quietly resigned in November 1944 and died in 1958, never held accountable for his role in blocking rescue. John McCoy, who rejected bombing Auschwitz, went on to a distinguished career in public service. The State Department officials who delayed visas and suppressed information faced no consequences. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended. He never publicly acknowledged his administration's failures regarding the Holocaust. He never explained why he waited until January 1940 to create the War Refugee Board. He never answered for the warnings ignored, the telegrams suppressed, the witnesses dismissed. History remembers him as the architect of victory against fascism, and that's not wrong. But it's incomplete. The fuller truth is more complex, more uncomfortable, more human. Roosevelt was a leader capable of extraordinary vision and decisive action when he chose to act. The tragedy is that when it came to the Holocaust, for years he chose not to. The report Henry Morgenthau brought to the Oval Office that Sunday morning in January 1944 forced Roosevelt's hand, but it came too late for millions. That report documented what we now know beyond any doubt. America knew. Roosevelt knew. They could have done more, and they chose not to. What can we learn from this history? What does it tell us about power, about moral courage, about the cost of prioritizing politics over human lives? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions every generation must answer when confronted with atrocity. The Holocaust happened because the Nazis chose evil, but its scale, its devastating completeness was enabled by the silence and inaction of those who knew and did nothing. That includes the American government. That includes Franklin Roosevelt. Acknowledging that doesn't diminish the genuine heroism of American soldiers who fought and died defeating Nazi Germany. It doesn't erase Roosevelt's leadership during the Depression or the war, but it demands that we remember the complete story, not the sanitized version. Because only by understanding the full truth can we hope to do better when faced with our own moral tests. So here's the question I want you to consider. If you'd been in Roosevelt's position, with the Riegner telegram on your desk in August 1942, with Jan Karski sitting across from you in July 1943, with requests to bomb Auschwitz arriving in the summer of 1944, what would you have done? It's easy to judge from 80 years in the future. It's harder to imagine the political pressures, the competing priorities, the genuine uncertainty about what actions would be effective. But ultimately, that's the question history asks of every leader and every citizen. When you know about atrocity, when you have the power to act, what do you choose? Roosevelt chose to wait. He chose politics over rescue. He chose to prioritize other concerns. And millions died. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think differently about American history and moral leadership, leave a comment below. What do you think Roosevelt should have done? When should rescue have become a priority? And are there parallels today, situations where we know about atrocity but fail to act? Hit that like button if you want more history that challenges comfortable narratives and tells the complex truth. Subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Because history isn't just about remembering what happened, it's about learning from what we failed to do and making sure we do better next time.